The year was 1870, a time when America was stitching itself back together after the ravages of the Civil War. But on the banks of the Mississippi in New Orleans, a different kind of war was brewing. One fought with iron, steam, and an almost suicidal level of human ego. To look upon the levee on the afternoon of June 30th was to witness the raw, beating heart of the American machine. New Orleans, the Crescent City, was a sensory overload. The air was a thick soup of humidity, the smell of sun-baked mud, the sweetness of overripe sugarcane, an acrid, biting scent of coal dust. Thousands of people had descended upon the waterfront. They came from the gambling dens of the French Quarter, the elegant mansions of the Garden District, and the cramped shanties of the dockworkers. They were there to witness the race of the century. Moored at the foot of Canal Street were the two protagonists of our tale, the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez. To the casual observer, they were floating palaces of white gingerbread wood and towering black chimneys, but to the men who worked them, they were dangerous, temperamental beasts. The Natchez was the pride of Captain Thomas P. Leathers. She was a massive vessel, 303 feet long, boasting 6 massive boilers. Leathers, a man of fierce Southern pride who refused to fly the U.S. flag even years after the war, treated the Natchez like a queen. She was built for luxury as much as speed, her cabins filled with Belgian carpets and crystal chandeliers. Across the pier sat the Robert E. Lee, commanded by Captain John W. Cannon. If the Natchez was a queen, the Lee was a gladiator. Cannon was a man of cold, calculating pragmatism. He had done something that scandalized the river community. He stripped the Lee of her dignity. He removed the heavy ornamental railings, the fine furniture, and even the heavy cabin doors to shave every possible pound of weight. He refused to take a single passenger or a single crate of freight. While the wealthy elite sipped mint juleps on the upper decks, a different world existed below the waterline. The engine rooms were the closest thing to a literal hell on earth. The heat often exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Here, the firemen stood before the yawning orange maws of the furnaces. To win, coal was not enough. They used resin-heavy pine knots and barrels of oil-soaked rags. This was the great gamble. The boilers were made of riveted iron, and every extra pound of pressure brought the ship closer to a catastrophic explosion. But on this day, safety was secondary. Pride was the only currency that mattered. As the skyline of New Orleans was swallowed by twilight, the reality of the task settled in. This was a 1,200-mile marathon. By midnight, a treacherous, milky white vapor, the river blindness, began to rise. In such conditions, any sane captain would stop, but not Cannon. Pilot Wes Fuller navigated by the echoes. He would blow the steam whistle and listen for the sound to bounce off the high bluffs. By calculating the return of the sound, he mapped the river in his mind, a display of human genius that predated radar by nearly a century. As they approached Baton Rouge, fuel became a crisis. Usually, a boat would tie up for an hour to load wood. To save time, Cannon arranged for a smaller tender boat, the Frank Pargand, to meet them mid-river. While moving at 10 miles per hour, crews flung heavy planks between the moving ships. Men scrambled across the swaying gap as the dark water churned violently between the hulls. The Lee never touched the shore. By 4 a.m., the Lee was near Vicksburg. The fog was so thick that the bow was invisible. Suddenly, a massive snag or sunken tree appeared. One slip of the wheel, and the race would end in a watery grave. But Fuller didn't flinch. He steered the Lee into the slack water near the shore, seeking the path of least resistance, while the Natchez stayed in the deeper, faster current, betting on her sheer horsepower. Captain Leathers on the Natchez was incensed. He considered Cannon's mid-river fueling and his reckless speed through the fog to be cheating, a violation of the gentlemanly codes of the river. But the river didn't care about codes. As the dawn broke, the Robert E. Lee emerged like a specter. She was battered, soot-stained, and stripped of her beauty, but she was leading. The crowd on the shore saw a ship that looked like it had been through a war. In the engine room, the firemen were breaking down the mahogany bulkheads to feed the furnaces. The steam gauges moved past the red line. The boilers hummed a high-pitched metallic note, a warning that the iron was at its breaking point. As we conclude this first major chapter, the lesson is clear. In the race of life, your greatest burden is often the things you refuse to let go of. Captain Leathers was a man of tradition, and his tradition weighed him down. Captain Cannon was a man of the future, cold, calculated, and willing to burn his own house down to win. The gauge of pride had been set, the fires were lit, and the river, indifferent to the egos of men, waited to see who would survive the 1,200-mile duel.
The second leg of the great race began not with a bang, but with a suffocating silence. As the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez churned past the dark bluffs of Vicksburg, the river ceased to be a highway and became a predatory beast. The Mississippi in 1870 was a shifting, living entity, filled with snags, sunken trees that could disembowel a boat in seconds, and sandbars that moved like ghosts under the brown silt. For Captain John W. Cannon, the lead was a fragile thing. The lee was vibrating so violently from the overpressured boilers that the glass in the pilot house had begun to crack. But Cannon did not blink. He was no longer just a captain. He was a gambler playing against the river itself. Deep below the waterline, the engine room had become a literal furnace of human suffering. The air was thick with the smell of scorched oil and the metallic tang of overstrained iron. The coal walkers were collapsing, their lungs filled with dust. But the furnace doors never closed for more than a second. When the coal ran low, the order went out: anything that burns. Crewmen began hauling barrels of turpentine-soaked rags and slabs of salt pork from the larder. They threw the fat into the fires, creating a chemical heat so intense that the boiler jackets began to turn a dull, pulsating red. Every rivet in the ship's hull was a tiny bullet held in place only by the grace of God and the skill of the engineers. If one boiler plate failed, the resulting explosion would send a column of fire 500 feet into the air, leaving nothing behind but splinters. As the race reached the graveyard stretch, a series of razor-sharp bends near Memphis, the fog rolled in like a thick, wet shroud. On any other night, a pilot would be considered insane to travel at more than 5 knots. Captain Cannon, however, signaled for full speed. Pilot Wes Fuller was a man possessed. He couldn't see the bow, but he knew the river's song. He listened to the slap of the water against the banks. He memorized every echo of the steam whistle. "Starboard," he would bark, his hands blurring on the massive walnut wheel. The lee would pivot, her 300-foot frame missing a deadly sandbar by inches. Behind them, the Natchez was relentless. Captain Leathers, driven by a fury that bordered on the divine, was refusing to let the lee escape. He was pushing his engine so hard that the Natchez chimneys were spitting sparks like a volcanic eruption, lighting up the night sky for miles. The greatest challenge arrived at the junction of the Ohio River. Both ships were starving for fuel. Captain Leathers opted to tie up at a known woodyard, trusting his crew's speed to load coal in under an hour. It was a traditional move, a safe move. But Cannon was done with safety. He had arranged a flying fuel transfer. A coal barge was towed out into the center of the churning current. As the lee thundered past, she didn't stop. Instead, she snagged the barge with grappling hooks, dragging the heavy iron platform alongside her at 12 knots. Men leapt across the gap, shoveling coal like demons while the two hulls ground together, throwing sparks that looked like fireworks. It was a suicidal maneuver, a mid-river theft of time that defied every rule of the Mississippi. By the time the Natchez finished loading at the dock, the lee was a smudge of smoke on the horizon. The lead was now 20 miles. The trial of iron and will teaches us a hard truth about human ambition. There is a point where the machine stops being a tool and becomes a master. By the time the ships reached the Missouri line, the men were no longer fighting for a trophy. They were fighting to stay awake, to stay alive, and to keep their world from tearing itself apart. Captain Cannon had stripped his ship of luxury, but the river was now stripping him of his humanity. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were blistered, but his will remained as cold and hard as the iron in his boilers. He understood that in history, the trial of will isn't about who is the strongest. It's about who is willing to burn the most to reach the finish line. As the spires of St. Louis finally appeared through the haze, the Robert E. Lee was no longer a palace. She was a blackened, soot-covered skeleton of a ship, but she was flying. And behind her, the Natchez was finally beginning to fade, her pride intact, but her victory stolen by a man who refused to believe in limits.
The morning of July 4th, 1870 broke with a heavy golden humidity over the city of St. Louis. For 3 days, 8 hours, and 14 minutes, the entire American continent had been holding its breath. Telegraph offices across the nation were crowded with people waiting for a single sentence from the wires. Downriver, the Robert E. Lee was a sight of terrifying beauty. She was no longer the pristine white vessel that had left New Orleans. Her chimneys were scorched to a dull, flaking gray. Her hull was blackened by the soot of 1,000 barrels of resin and fat. She looked less like a ship and more like a cinder hurled across the water by the hand of a vengeful god. Captain John W. Cannon stood on the hurricane deck. His eyes were hollow, sunken into a face masked by coal dust and dried sweat. He hadn't slept in over 80 hours. Every time his eyelids began to droop, the rhythmic thump-thump of the overpressured boilers reminded him that he was riding a lightning bolt. Below deck, the scene was one of quiet exhaustion. The firemen were no longer shouting. They moved like automatons, their muscles stiff from the unrelenting heat. They had burned through the coal, they had burned through the pine knots. In the final hours, Cannon had ordered the wooden doors of the guest staterooms and the fine mahogany railings to be fed into the furnaces. "If we arrive in St. Louis as a flatboat, so be it," Cannon had whispered. The steam gauges were vibrating so intensely they could no longer be read. The safety valves were pinned down by iron weights, a move that would have seen any captain stripped of his license in a time of peace. But this was not peace. This was the final defiance of the age of steam. As the Eads Bridge, a skeleton of steel then under construction, appeared in the distance, the riverbanks exploded. An estimated 50,000 people had lined the levee. The rooftops of the warehouses were sagging under the weight of spectators. At 11:25 a.m., the Robert E. Lee swept past the finish line. The sound was like a physical wall. Cannons roared from the shore. Tens of thousands of voices screamed in a unison of triumph. The Lee had covered 1,218 miles in 3 days, 18 hours, and 14 minutes, a record that would never be broken by a commercial steamboat. Captain Cannon did not cheer. He simply signaled the engineer to stand by. As the steam pressure finally began to drop, a strange, haunting whistle escaped the pipes, a sound that some said felt like a long-held breath finally being released. 6 hours later, the Natchez rounded the final bend. Captain Thomas P. Leathers stood on his deck, his head held high, his ship still carrying the dignity of her cargo and her passengers. He had lost the race, but he had kept his honor. He had refused to burn his furniture. He had refused to endanger his passengers by pinning his valves. As the two ships sat moored together at the St. Louis wharf, the contrast was a historical poem. The Lee was the victor of speed, but she was a wreck. The Natchez was the queen of the river, but she was the loser of the race. But as the sun set over the Mississippi on that Independence Day, a quiet realization began to settle over the crowd. While the Lee and the Natchez were fighting each other, a new sound was growing in the distance, the rhythmic clack-clack of iron wheels on steel rails. The Great Race was the last hurrah of the steamboat era. Within a decade, the railroads would stretch like a web across the continent, moving goods faster and more reliably than any boat ever could. The danger, the romance, and the raw, unbridled ego of the river captains were being replaced by the cold, calculated schedules of the locomotive. The race didn't just prove who was the fastest, it served as a funeral march for a romantic age. The Mississippi, once the untamable god of American commerce, was being mastered by bridges and bypassed by tracks. The lesson left for us in the soot of the Robert E. Lee is one of bittersweet progress. Victory often comes at the cost of the very world we are trying to win. Captain Cannon won the race, but in doing so, he pushed the machine to its absolute limit, proving that even the fastest boat could barely keep up with the changing times. The era of the palace on the water was over. The era of the machine had truly begun. And as the smoke cleared from the St. Louis sky, the Mississippi returned to its ancient silence, carrying the ghosts of the Lee and the Natchez into the pages of legend.